we bounce this term around about maturity all the time, but we don't really ever talk about what we mean by it. So I'm going to take a moment and just get some clear definitions on the table so that we're all talking about the same thing. And so one can think of maturity as a way to represent consistent capability. When we talk about it, other than in terms of personality, what we're really talking about is whether a person or a group of people are capable of delivering consistent quality, delivering consistent. I'm trying to say delivering consistent capability, but capable of delivering capability doesn't make sense. Uh, the idea that what we're trying to do here is understand whether someone is working at their most capable or at their least capable, and somewhere in between. What could they do to become more capable? This is the purpose of sort of talking about maturity, and in particular, it's been a fad for a couple of decades now, about four to be exact, to talk about organizational maturity models. This is a way to take some theme, whether it's software maturity models or diversity maturity models, and sort of talk about the capability of delivering high quality results. And UX maturity models have not escaped this at all. There's been a bunch of attempts at this. And usually a maturity model is divided into stages that represent growth. You take the sort of different indicators that show that someone or a group are capable of doing a thing, and you divide them into meaningful chunks. It's a way to talk about the evolution of capability within uh, a group of individuals or a bigger group. And the uh, the primary use of having a maturity model is to sort of assess where people are, to be able to say, okay, this this person or this group of people are less mature than that person or that group of people, and we want to get them to be more uh, equal. We want to get their maturity to be on par with each other. So we look at the maturity model as a way of assessing people, and then collectively, and then saying, okay, these are the steps that we should focus on next in order to bring people up to the next level of maturity. And so that's the basic underlying premise of this. And as I mentioned, there have been several UX maturity models floating around over the years. Um, uh, and it's not hard to find them. You just Google them. Nielsen Norman has one, and Vision has one. There's two or three others that have floated around. Um, but what makes all those maturity models uh, sort of less useful, at least to me, has been that they are all focused on the maturity of organizations. In almost all cases, they are their primary use is to argue to senior management that we are not mature enough, and that we need to invest more in UX. And I have found this to not be that helpful. First, it's not a winning argument to get more investment. So you can argue all you want that you're not mature. If the people you're arguing to don't understand the maturity, it's not a compelling argument to them. As far as they're concerned, everything is fine. So why would they make any more investment? So it's not useful in that regard. But more importantly, it's not useful in terms of helping us know how to get the organization to be more mature. And that's because the idea of a maturity model that's based on an entire organization assumes that the organization moves in lockstep, that they are all together at each level. And that isn't the way it works. It's not representative of how organizations work, how organizations get better. To say that we're at a stage 3 and we need to move to a stage 4 implies that everybody in the organization is at stage 3. And that's not really the reality that any of us work in. It's not helpful there. And more importantly, it's almost impossible to assess an, an organization's entire maturity, right? It's the way people try to do it is that they uh, basically average across the whole organization. And we've talked before about how averages are really a an unproductive way to do a lot of things, and this is one of the things that averages are unproductive at. To take to take a group where there's a range of capabilities and to average them out is um, uh, the is basically to take your most advanced people and use them to cancel out your least advanced people to get this um, uh, this notion of some sort of forward movement across the path. But you're trying to get you're trying to move people from a stage they're not in to another stage they're not in, and that doesn't help anybody. So we produced a while back a maturity model that is not aimed at the organization, but instead is actually aimed at um, teams. And this worked much, much better. We found this to be much more useful. And the reason is because if you treat every team, a team being a unit within the organization that has some amount of independence or autonomy to do the work they need to do to deliver something, when you work that way, you can clearly see that there's a wide breadth of maturity across the organization. But more importantly, you can direct attention at a single team and figure out what to do to get them to be better. And that works much more effectively. So the model that we came up with is uh, looks like this. It starts with what we call the UX dark ages. And in the UX dark ages, the members of the team are really not focused on UX. They're focused on the the needs of the business. They're focused on what the technology is trying to do, what they're trying to do with the technology. But what they're not focused on is UX. UX is really not on the table here. Um, Primarily because it's hard enough to get the business and the technology to sort of work together. So so that's when we're talking about the UX dark ages, we're talking about a team. Remember, this is a team, not an organization. It could be that every team in the organization is here, but it's not that important to know what the organization is. It's only important to know what the team is. A given team is really they don't pay attention to users at all. It's not on their radar. It's not something they care about. They're just pushing things out the door, and the people on that team are really only focused on these things. Now, when you are dealing with this, uh, there's an inflection point, right? So teams get more mature, and they get more mature when some sort of change happens, and the inflection point happens when suddenly there's someone on the team who actually cares about UX enough to put some energy into it and to talk about it. So now the team cares about the business needs, they care about what the technology is doing, and they care about the UX, but only on a per project basis. And what happens with this is that there are small improvements in the user experience because this person's there. The other folks on the team still don't quite get it, but they're willing to take it. And we call this spot UX design. And spot UX design uh, is a stage where you've got one person who's thinking about the UX. They're in essence more mature than the other people on the team, but the organization has all of these forces that basically squashes any of the effort that it takes, because in general UX takes resources and energy away from the business and the technology needs. And if you take too much of that away and people don't understand why you need to be doing that in general, what happens is this sort of disappears, right? We call it spot UX design because it shows up for a little while and then it goes away, and it shows up again and it goes away. And you may get a good release or two out of something, and then the follow on sort of falls apart. The next stage that we see happens when, for some reason, and there's a bunch of reasons that can contribute to this, a uh, a UX leader is appointed to a manager position. Give them a little tie here, and uh, that often happens because some executive, for the first time, has realized that there is um, uh, there's a business value to producing better user experience. Oftentimes, this happens because they're getting beaten up by their competitors for not having good UX. There are other externalities that can cause this. There can be some internal folks, some internal reasons to improve the design. People are realizing that poor design is costing the organization a lot of money, or potentially costing them sales. So they decide, okay, we're going to build a UX team. So they hire a manager, they hire a bunch of UX people to go with the manager, and they create what we call UX design as a service. And they basically open up a tiny little agency within the organization whose job it is to help all of the teams that are either in spot UX design or in the dark ages be able to start to do it. So these folks work with these other teams to be able to gain maturity. And at some point, there are teams that are doing more than spot UX. They consider UX for every project that they work on. However, these teams are still using the UX expertise that comes out of this sort of UX team that is being this internal service. So these folks are all working with the different teams as they mature, as they get on, and their understanding as to the value of UX, their understanding as to UX practice, you know. Whereas in spot UX, you don't see them scheduling their next project to have a lot of sort of UX ritual, UX practice, UX process. You don't see that here. With design as a service, there's a lot of emphasis on practice, on process, on methodology. And so you see that happening here. And we used to think that if we could just get a big enough team to serve all the other teams in the organization, that was the game we were playing. That was where we were trying to get to. But what we found was that there was another inflection point. And that other inflection point happens when there's a team that is uh, busy working. They have realized that they are that UX is a critical part of the experience that they deliver. That they need to have a good user experience, and that the user experience work, all the low hanging fruit, has started to be basically picked from this. And what's happening now is that the UX problems they have are more challenging or more difficult because they're sort of deeper in the experience issues that they have, and they're trying to use the service team, the official UX team, to build this stuff. But the problem is that official UX team member keeps getting pulled onto other projects. And they get a new member, and they don't have them full time. And they start to get frustrated. And when they get frustrated, they say, you know what, we need our own UX effort. So they go and they hire someone to actually be part of their team, separate from the design as a service team. And we call this embedded UX. And embedded UX design is what happens when you truly embed. And by truly embedding, I mean this person now reports to the manager, and give this manager a little hat. The manager who runs the embedded team, who is not a UX person themselves. And this being embedded, this reporting directly to that, is critical, because this is the first time where if that manager who runs that team disagrees with the way that the UX as a service team runs, this manager wins, right? You can't pull this person away. They're going to follow the practices of this team. It's not going to necessarily follow the overall practices that the UX team has created. But this UX person still needs support, and this is where design ops comes in, because it's really about supporting, or part of it is really about supporting these embedded designers who are no longer part of the team but still need the tools and capabilities that you get when you have a larger UX effort across an organization. And we used to think, well, if we could get every team to have someone embedded in it, a UX designer embedded, researcher, whatever you want to call them, some UX person. If we could get somebody embedded in this team, that in itself would that would win, right? That'd be the winning situation. But we realized that there's actually one more inflection point, and that inflection point happens. Find a pen here that I like. There we go. We'll use this one. That inflection point happens when you've got a team, including some embedded UX resources. But what's been happening is this team has been paying attention, and they now are starting to pick up some of the UX practices, some of the UX skills, some of the UX capabilities. For instance, the developers have been, with maybe the help of a design system, have been learning how to produce decent looking screens. And they've learned enough that they can produce decent looking screens. So it's no longer the case that the UX designer has to redo every first draft screen that the developers do, because back here the developers were creating screens basically by vomiting the database onto the display, but here they're actually doing a decent job of thinking about the use case and making that work. You no longer have um, uh, uh, product managers just going out and asking customers, what will you want us to build, but instead actually doing decent research. And so they're learning UX skills. And suddenly we've got people learning UX skills all the way across the organization. And when this happens, we reach the stage that we currently believe is the final stage, which we call infused UX design. And infused UX design is when you've got research capabilities all through the team. They all have skills and capabilities themselves. So what we have here is each team is getting more and more mature about UX as we go. Back here, they weren't thinking about it. Here, one of the people was thinking about it, but everybody else was trying not to. Here, people are thinking about it, they're doing it, but they're thinking about it in a very sort of rote way of process and technique. It's focused on on outputs, not outcomes. Here we start to look at outcomes, and we're now making sure that teams have full-time UX capabilities, whereas here it's still, drop in, drop out, uh, uh, as a service type thing. And here, the teams themselves are all thinking about user experience all the time, and the folks who are most capable with UX are now working on the really hard, really big problems, while everybody else is doing the same things that used to be done by UX people down in these stages. It's all done by other members of the team. And so we get more and more mature as we move up the ladder. And from a UX leader standpoint, what we're trying to do is get every team, as many teams as we can, to be infused, or at least embedded, because when we do that, the organization as a whole is far more capable, far better off to be able to deliver great results. So we're always trying to push in that direction. And so when we talk about leading a team with low maturity, what we're really talking about is leading the teams that are down here. Because we behave differently with teams down here than we do with teams up here. Teams up here understand what we're doing. We're not selling them UX anymore. We're actually making them more effective, more efficient. What we're trying to do is really help them deliver on their own. Whereas teams down here need to understand why it's even important, what the purpose is, what is happening. So when we're talking about low maturity teams, that's what we're talking about. And again, it doesn't make sense to think of the organization. You can try and say, well, where is my organization as a whole? And if you've got teams down here, you've got teams that are up here, what does that actually mean? The maturity of whole, it's like talking about the average shoe size. In the US, the average men's shoe size is 8 3/4. But who wears an 8 3/4? How does that help shoe manufacturers understand what to produce? It doesn't, right? It's not a useful number to know. And average across the whole organization maturity is not useful to know. You can't do anything with it. Um, the best thing to do is to talk about how many teams are immature and what that costs the organization. And then what the benefits are as you raise maturity for each team. But you really only can talk about this on a team by team basis. And even then, you're going to struggle, because what determines where a team is actually the individual who is least mature. And so now we have to talk about individual maturity. And individual maturity it's easier to sort of zoom in and talk about on a different scale. So to talk about individual maturity, what we want to talk about is how people basically learn to understand something, right? How they grow their understanding. And there's uh, a theory that we sort of base our individual maturity model on, created by a guy named Martin Broadwell, though it's often attributed to another guy named Noel Birch, but he just sort of publicized it. The 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 idea of this maturity model is that there are four stages. Uh, the lowest stage is unconscious incompetence, and unconscious incompetence is basically when you know how to when you don't know how to do something, you're incompetent at it, right? You're not good at cooking, you're not good at speaking a foreign language, you're not good at playing a musical instrument, you're not good at design, you're not good at research, right? It's when there's some set of skills that you're not good at, but you don't know you're not good at it. So you go and you try to do it. And uh, this stage is basically what defines it is that you can't see the difference between good versus bad, right? You can't tell when the food isn't good. You can't tell when the sentences you're saying in a foreign language don't make sense, right? From your perspective, it's all good. And so unconscious incompetence is this stage where it's indistinguishable between good and bad. And then what happens is there's, an inflection point, like in all maturity models. And the inflection point happens when somebody takes you aside and says, stop doing that, right? Please stop. You're not any good at this. It's just making everybody around you miserable. Nobody wants to tell you. I'm telling you, just stop. And now you suddenly know that good is not equal to bad, and you don't really understand how to change it, but you can start to see that it's not a good thing, and we call this conscious incompetence. You know that you're bad at something. You're not any good at it, but at least now you're aware of it, right? And this is where a lot of people give up, primarily because conscious incompetence is really depressing, right? Here you are thinking that you are really good at something, and someone tells you you're not. And now you're just mortified and shamed and embarrassed, and moving from that point forward is just, it's just shameful. So instead, uh, with this, you want to uh, uh, just basically keep going, right? You just want to try it out and learn it, and that's the inflection point. Is that you start to practice, you start to learn it, and over time you become what we call consciously competent. And conscious competence is when you've got the basic practices, you've got tools, you've got support to do a decent job. And you can start to hold conversations that make sense. You can start to play sheet music and read the notes, and it sounds decent. You can follow a recipe and make a decent dish. And that's what uh, conscious competence is about. If you don't have that support materials, if you don't think about everything you're doing, it doesn't come out good. But you can get to good outcomes uh, in a consistent way if you follow the tricks and methods that you learned. And that's uh, that's a great stage to be in. But it turns out there's one more inflection point. And that one more inflection point happens when you no longer need those support tools. you're now at a point where the you can play something decent without having the sheet music in front of you. You can have a conversation without having to think consciously about the construction of every sentence and the vocabulary you're using. You can take a bunch of ingredients and throw them into a pan, and what comes out is pretty darn good because you've learned it and you've internalized it. And this is actually called unconscious competence. And unconscious competence just sort of happens, right? Um, it is it is the ability to do the work without much conscious thought and to get good outcomes. So uh, this is basically good outcomes without thought. And so we based our individual model on this model that Martin Broadwell came up with. And uh, what makes this interesting is what we found from a UX design standpoint and research standpoint is the transitions. How do you get from being unconsciously incompetent to consciously incompetence? And that transition of going from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, we call literacy. Because what you're learning is the difference between good and bad. You are learning that they are not the same, that there is a language, that there is a way to think about it, and that um, uh, this is key. And once you start to see this, once you start to understand that there's a difference here, it becomes quick to realize that the work that you've been doing has been bad, because good doesn't happen by accident, bad does. So you quickly realize that most of the stuff you've done has not been very good, and it's this jump from unconscious incompetence to conscious competence, this notion of gaining literacy, that really pushes people forward. And so that's key. And if you can do that in a way that doesn't raise all the shame and embarrassment and cause people to say, I'm not a good designer, I'm never going to do this again, right? You can get them to persist. And that persistence allows you to get to the next stage. Whereas the next stage, from conscious incompetence to conscious competence, we call that fluency. And fluency is really about mastering the practice. It's about understanding the tools. It's about understanding what you need to do and to be able to start to get good outcomes. And then there's another transformation here, which is when we go from conscious competence to unconscious competency. That's what we call mastery, right? Because unconscious competence is really what we mean when we talk about mastering our craft, right? When we talk about mastering the craft, what we're doing here is we are, in fact, talking about what it means to have good outcomes, what it means to be able to really produce something that's effective. So this is the process. So now, if we're talking about people with low literacy or low maturity, we're talking about the folks that are here. Almost all of them lack literacy and they lack fluency. So the way that we grow maturity is through literacy and fluency. And fortunately, from a UX standpoint, there's a whole bunch of things we can do to grow literacy and fluency, particularly amongst the folks that are here. But it takes active work. And when we're trying to lead UX in the organization, we have to spend most of our focus on literacy and fluency down here. We don't have to spend it up here. It's not something that we need to do. What we can do is we can give the tools for literacy and fluency to the embedded designer because these folks have less of it, but they have enough of it that they're in this embedded stage where they want a designer. If they didn't want a designer, if they weren't there, they'd be back down here in the Spot UX stage. So even then, we don't need the same tools to support that we need when we're working with folks in the dark ages Spot UX and when we're first starting to work with them as a service and work with them on a regular basis. Because here they may see that this UX stuff is basically just checklist stuff. I need to do UX because I'm told I have to do UX, and we're just going to have a checklist here. And we're not going to really spend time understanding the value that it's bringing us. We're going to focus on that. So, the things that we can do, there's a whole bunch of them. One is we want to focus on vocabulary. When you give things names, that starts to help people understand differences. If you don't have words for something that is a poor design versus something that's a good design, then it doesn't help us. So, for example, if we have words like white space and clutter, those names help us have conversations. Then we have to define them. We have to show pictures of them. We have to show people what we mean when we say this design is cluttered, what we mean when this design has great white space, right? But now we've given them a name. So every distinction wants a name. And that's part of the language of literacy, is to actually be able to talk about what that is, right? When you're learning music, you have to learn what the notes are, what the chords are. And when you're learning to cook, you have to learn what the ingredients are, what the various kitchen implements are, right? And understanding what you do when, what it means to let something rise, what it means to let something simmer, right? This is all vocabulary. And so a lot of the work that we do is vocabulary based. And if we go in to a team and we just start talking jargon and we haven't brought them up to speed, they just tune us out. They don't understand what that is. So a lot of this has to be around that. And what I found is that the place to start is actually with research, right? The place to start is with what we call exposure, getting people exposed to real people doing real things. Because if we can get folks exposed to real people doing real things with our products, our services, with our competitors' products or services, with whatever they use before they use somebody's product or service, right? If we can see that, we can see the struggle they have, we can give that a name, we can see when it works really well, we can give that a different name, and then we can start to talk about the variations that we're seeing. The whole idea behind personas was to give them all names so we could talk about the differences. Unfortunately, personas have gotten so watered down that they're not helpful. We'll talk about that next week. But by giving everything a name, we can create this dialect that talks to what the differences are. So research with exposure, getting people to have 2 hours every 6 weeks, you see a dramatic increase in the capability and quality, because now they're being able, you're giving names to why the last experience we saw was different than the current experience we just saw, which may be different by the next one. Which one is the one we want to design for? Give these all these things a vocabulary, and suddenly we're able to have a conversation about what is a good experience, what is a poor experience. And then we can move on from there and we can talk in terms of things like critique. where we take a design and we start to describe what we're doing in the design. Design critique is different than design review. A design review is when you push something forward to be the uh, the to move it to its next stage of development, get it, into prototyping, get it from prototyping into development, get it from development into delivery, right? That's a design review. A design critique is really asking the question, how did the designer get to this moment? What was their thought process? Why did they make the choices they made? Were there other choices they could have made? Let's talk about that. And what we're doing is we're giving names to the process. We're giving names to the stages in the process. We're giving names to the different viewpoints that are there. And so we teach literacy through this this discussion, this active show, don't tell, but show type approach of really working on things. And then the other big tool that we have is deconstruction, sitting there and taking apart a screen, showing what parts are the UI, what parts are the, everybody's wrapped around the axle about people confusing UI and UX, but where do we have a conversation where we sit down and actually teach what makes UI and what makes UX and work through all of that? It's hard to do in the abstract, but it's easy to do when you're watching someone's experience and the problem they're having is not a UI problem. The problem they're having is a poor experience problem. So those are sort of the main methods. There are other methods that I've talked about in the past, doing side-by-side comparisons to establish vocabulary, doing what are called UI stand-ups, where you basically take the work that was done yesterday and you take it apart. Design studios, where you ask people to whether they have design in their background or not, to actually participate in design. Pairing designers and developers together is a great way to raise developer understanding of design and UX. Talking about confidence and research, that's a session we're going to do in a few weeks. That's a way to talk about this. Talking about design rationale, having principles that emerge and using those as rationale for designing these things. And these types of elements are key. Talking about scenarios, we'll talk about that next week as an alternative to personas. And finally, just having regular reflections on what we learned and giving these things names, right? All of these things are about building literacy. And the more we build literacy, the more we bring these folks who are lower maturity along. And it's that process that gets us what we want. So that's what I came to talk to you about today.
Jared here. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing so you'll get more videos like this. If you have any comments, questions, or thoughts, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And hey, consider joining our Leaders of Awesomeness community. It's completely free, home to over 50,000 UX leaders who regularly share questions, ideas, inspiration about their experiences. The link is in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.